On the morning of October 30th, 2025, a man who had carried the title Prince for 65 years stopped being one. Not through a court ruling, not through Parliament, but through a single, carefully worded statement released by Buckingham Palace. By lunchtime, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, formerly His Royal Highness the Duke of York, was simply a private citizen with a very famous surname. And for those watching the monarchy closely, the real story wasn't just what King Charles had done. It was what it revealed about the man waiting to inherit the throne after him. The palace statement itself was brief and unusually blunt for an institution built on understatement. It said the king had initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and honors of Prince Andrew, and that he would now be known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. It added that their majesties' thoughts remained with the victims and survivors of any and all forms of abuse. For an institution that had spent years managing Andrew's decline in careful half measures, this was different. This was final. To understand why it happened when it did, you have to go back to the pressure that had been building for months. Andrew's association with the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein had never fully gone away since his disastrous 2019 Newsnight interview, but it reignited with new intensity after the publication of a posthumous memoir by Virginia Giuffre, who had accused Andrew of sexual assault when she was a minor, allegations he has consistently denied, and which were settled in a civil case without any admission of liability. Giuffre died earlier in 2025, and the memoir reopened wounds that the palace had hoped were closing. Around the same time, an investigation by the Times used a Freedom of Information request to reveal that Andrew had been living at the 30-room Royal Lodge on a peppercorn rent, a nominal, largely symbolic sum, despite having stepped back from public duties years earlier. That detail, more than almost anything else, seemed to crystallize public frustration. It wasn't just about the scandal anymore. It was about privilege that no longer matched contribution. The consequences moved quickly once they started. Formal notice was served for Andrew to surrender his lease and vacate Royal Lodge, with the palace confirming he would relocate to alternative private accommodation on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. His last remaining military rank, Vice Admiral, was stripped in early November after Defense Secretary John Healey confirmed the government was following the king's lead. His membership in the Order of the Garter, one of the oldest and most exclusive orders of chivalry in the world, was also removed, a loss royal watchers described as particularly symbolic, since Andrew had reportedly once described himself as a prince first, a naval officer second. By February 2026, he had returned Norway's Grand Cross of the Order of St. Olav, and New Zealand confirmed it had cancelled a commemorative medal awarded to him decades earlier, acting on the king's direction. And yet, for all of that, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor remains 8th in the line of succession. That detail surprises a lot of people, and it's worth explaining clearly rather than glossing over it, because it says something important about how limited even a monarch's power actually is. According to analysis from the Constitution Unit at University College London, removing someone from the line of succession entirely is a different and far heavier legal process than stripping titles or honors. Titles and styles are largely within the sovereign's own prerogative to grant or withdraw. The line of succession, by contrast, is protected by a convention rooted in the Statute of Westminster of 1931, which generally requires the agreement of every other Commonwealth realm where the king is also head of state, 14 other nations, each with their own political processes. King Charles could strip his brother of every title he had in an afternoon. He could not, acting alone, remove him from the succession itself. That distinction matters, because it shows this wasn't really about erasing Andrew from the family tree. It was about controlling what he could represent while he remained on it. Andrew's own response to the mounting pressure is worth pausing on, because it shows a man who understood exactly what was coming and tried, unsuccessfully, to get ahead of it. On October 17, 2025, roughly 2 weeks before the palace's formal statement, Andrew released his own announcement saying he had decided, in discussion with the king and his wider family, to stop using all of his remaining titles. He framed it as a voluntary decision made to protect the family from what he called continued distraction, adding that he stood by his choice 5 years earlier to step back from public duties. It read, to many royal watchers, as an attempt to control the narrative, to appear as though he was falling on his own sword rather than being pushed. The palace's far more forceful statement, less than 2 weeks later, suggested that whatever goodwill that gesture was meant to buy didn't hold. According to Loney's reporting, Andrew has never been especially graceful about losing ground, and insiders describe him as expected to leave Royal Lodge only kicking and screaming, reportedly still expecting the kind of staffing and comfort, a full household, a driver, a gardener, that came with a life he technically no longer has any official claim to. This is where the story becomes less about Charles and more about William. Multiple royal reporters and biographers have suggested, in the weeks around the announcement, that William's fingerprints were on this decision in ways the official palace language never spelled out. ITV's royal editor Chris Shipp reported at the time that the Prince of Wales fully supported his father's actions, and that the king's decisions carried the backing of the wider family. Other reporting went further. Journalist Rob Shooter, writing in his newsletter coverage of the story, cited sources describing William as effectively running the monarchy from the shadows on this particular issue, and claimed he had personally reviewed the wording of the palace's statement before it went out. A palace source pushed back on the more dramatic framing, telling the Daily Mail that the decision belonged to the king, with the support of the family, and that the process had been underway for some time before it became public. Both things can be true at once. That Charles made the formal decision as monarch, and that William was deeply involved in shaping it. That tension between official authorship and behind-the-scenes influence is really the heart of what makes this moment matter for William's eventual reign. Royal biographer Andrew Loney, whose book entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York was serialized extensively in the run-up to Andrew's title removal, has argued publicly that William reached his conclusions about his uncle long before Charles did. Speaking on the podcast Royal Exclusive, Loney suggested that William and Catherine had privately written Andrew off years earlier, describing him as something of an embarrassment within the family long before the wider public understood the scale of his exposure to Epstein. Loney's core argument is that William operates with less sentiment than his father when family conduct threatens the institution's standing, that where Charles tended to manage Andrew's decline gradually, William's instinct was always to move faster and more decisively. That claim is echoed, with slightly different texture, in reporting tied to royal correspondent Russell Meyer's book William and Catherine, The Monarchy's New Era. According to a source cited in coverage of that book, William had wanted his uncle pushed out of royal life as far back as the fallout from the 2019 Newsnight interview, well before the Epstein connections were as fully public as they later became. The source is quoted describing William's view of the situation in practical terms, that everything happening now shapes what the monarchy looks like when it eventually becomes his to run, and that seen through that lens, hesitation was never really an option. It's worth being careful here. These are sourced claims from insiders speaking to specific authors and outlets, not confirmed direct quotations from William himself, who has never spoken publicly and specifically about his uncle's downfall. The Prince of Wales has, true to form, said nothing on the record. But the pattern across multiple independent sources, Shipp's reporting, Loney's book, Meyer's book, and separate insider accounts given to outlets like Radar Online, points in a consistent direction. A future king who is willing to let his father absorb the public burden of a difficult decision, while quietly ensuring that decision gets made. It's also worth noting how the family chose to present itself in public in the immediate aftermath, because optics have always mattered enormously to this particular institution. Reporting around Remembrance Day events in November 2025 described the royals appearing together in what was widely read as a display of unity, a calculated signal that the family intended to move forward as a cohesive unit rather than let Andrew's disgrace fracture public confidence in the wider institution. That kind of choreography doesn't happen by accident. It reflects decisions made by the same communications machinery that drafted the original title stripping statement. The same machinery multiple sources suggest William has increasingly taken a hands-on interest in shaping, even while his father remains the reigning monarch. George Gross, a royal historian at King's College London, offered a useful way of framing the strategic logic behind the timing. In comments given to PBS News around the time of the announcement, he described the title removal as a clear statement that the palace needed its house in order, both for the present and for the future. Language that implicitly acknowledges this wasn't only about managing a scandal in 2025, it was about clearing obstacles before they became William's problem to solve as king, at a moment when Charles, then 76 and undergoing treatment for cancer, was working to shore up the institution's foundations for his son to inherit. Gross's observation that the move felt inevitable captures something important about how royal historians have read this entire sequence, less as a sudden rupture and more as the closing chapter of a process that had been building quietly for years. What makes this moment genuinely significant, rather than just another news cycle about a disgraced royal, is what it suggests about the operating principles William may bring to the throne. Constitutional monarchy runs on precedent and restraint far more than on formal law, and the way a family handles its most damaging members tends to set the tone for how it handles everyone else. Historically, the Windsors have tended toward containment rather than expulsion, reducing a person's public role, limiting their access to funding and engagements, but rarely making a clean, permanent, publicly announced break of the kind seen here. Diana's loss of the HRH style after her divorce and Sarah Ferguson's similar loss after hers offer earlier precedents for stripping styles following the end of a marriage, but Andrew's case is different in kind. This wasn't a divorce settlement working through its natural legal consequences. This was a sitting monarch actively choosing, under significant public pressure, to formally strip his own sibling of titles built up over more than 6 decades, while that sibling continued to deny the underlying allegations against him. It's also worth remembering that Andrew wasn't the only figure whose royal footing shifted in this period, even if his case was by far the most severe. The years surrounding this announcement saw the monarchy quietly redrawing lines around who gets to represent it and under what conditions. New roles and warrants formalized for William and Catherine, continued questions about what limited public role, if any, Beatrice and Eugenie might retain given their father's fall, and a general tightening of who is allowed to be seen as speaking for the institution versus who is simply, privately, a member of an extended family. Andrew's case was the most dramatic version of a broader theme. That royal identity, in this era of the monarchy, is being treated less as an inherited birthright and more as a conditional arrangement, renewed or revoked based on conduct. For William, inheriting an institution that has just demonstrated it's willing to do that to a king's own brother sets a very different baseline than the one his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, operated under for most of her 70-year reign. Elizabeth's approach to family scandal, from the abdication crisis's long shadow to the difficult years of the 1990s, generally leaned toward patience, private pressure, and waiting for problems to resolve themselves with time. Charles's decision on Andrew breaks from that instinct in a way that multiple royal commentators have read as explicitly preparing the ground for William's reign, not just resolving Charles's own reign's crisis. If that reading holds, then the Andrew situation isn't really a story about one disgraced uncle. It's a preview of how the next monarch is expected to treat the gap between family loyalty and institutional survival, and multiple sources close to the family have suggested, in reporting across several outlets in the months following the announcement, that William views that gap with considerably less patience than his father ever did. There's also a practical, financial dimension to this story that tends to get lost beneath the more dramatic headlines about titles and honors, but which royal finance reporters have flagged as just as consequential. Andrew's removal from official royal life raises longer-term questions about how his household will be funded going forward, and whether any residual support will continue to come through arrangements connected to the Duchy of Lancaster or private income from the king, rather than public funds. The move to Sandringham, on private estate land rather than a crown estate property like Royal Lodge, was itself widely interpreted as part of the effort to draw a cleaner line between what belongs to the institution and what belongs to Charles and his brother as private individuals. That distinction matters enormously for a monarchy that has spent the better part of a decade trying to demonstrate financial restraint and public accountability, particularly after years of scrutiny over the sovereign grant and how taxpayer money intersects with royal life. A future king inheriting a cleaner separation between institutional assets and family obligations is inheriting one less minefield to navigate than his father did. None of this erases the human cost sitting underneath the constitutional analysis. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor is, whatever the allegations against him and whatever his own conduct, still someone's brother, someone's father, and someone whose adult daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, have had to watch their father's public unraveling play out largely in headlines rather than in private conversation. Reporting has suggested tension in how Andrew's future within the family will affect Beatrice and Eugenie's own limited royal roles going forward, a question that remains genuinely unresolved as of this recording. Royal historians studying this period will likely spend years debating exactly how much of this was Charles's decision, how much was William's influence, and how much was simply the accumulated weight of a scandal too large for any single family, royal or otherwise, to fully contain. There's a broader lesson here too, one that extends well beyond Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's particular circumstances, about how institutions built on inherited legitimacy survive into a media environment that no longer grants them automatic deference. For centuries, royal scandal was managed through silence, distance, and time, the assumption that public attention would eventually move on if the family simply waited it out. What the Andrew case demonstrates, arguably more clearly than any royal controversy since the death of Diana, is that this old playbook no longer reliably works. Investigative journalism, freedom of information requests, and a publishing industry willing to serialize unflattering biographies well in advance of their release dates have combined to strip away the layers of discretion the monarchy once relied on. Robert Hardman, whose biography Charles III, New King, New Court chronicled the early years of this reign in detail, has written extensively about how Charles came to the throne determined to run a more transparent, more accountable institution than the one he inherited, and the Andrew situation, whether by design or by necessity, became an early test of whether that ambition could survive contact with a genuine family crisis. By most measures, that test forced the institution's hand rather than the other way around, and the palace found itself reacting to pressure it could no longer contain quietly, rather than setting the terms of the story on its own timeline. What can be said with confidence is this. On one October morning, the palace drew a line that hadn't existed in quite the same form before, and the family's public unity in the months since, including reporting that senior royals appeared together for the first time since the announcement, presenting a deliberately unified front, suggests the decision, however it was actually reached behind closed doors, has held. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor lost his titles, his residence, his honors, and his military rank, but not his place in the line of succession, because even a king's authority has limits written into centuries of constitutional convention. And somewhere in that gap between what Charles could do alone and what he chose to do with his son standing beside him, royal watchers believe we got our clearest look yet at the kind of monarch William intends to be, one who protects the institution first and asks forgiveness, if it comes at all, only after the decision is already made. Whether that turns out to be a strength or a cost the family pays privately for years to come is a question no palace statement will ever fully answer, and it's one royal historians, biographers, and correspondents will keep returning to long after this particular chapter closes.